This is Creepy, a podcast dedicated to sharing the most famous, chilling, and disturbing creepypastas and urban legends in the world. Whether these stories truly happened or are simply fabrications is for you to decide. These stories may contain graphic depictions of violence and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Creepy presents Strange Finds, written by Georgia Cook. I found it on the foreshore down by Blackfriars Bridge. A little white hand sticking straight up out of the mud, glinting in the afternoon sun. It was small, maybe the size of a 20-pence piece, and as I crouched down to give it a tug, I already knew I'd found something special. I don't know if you've ever experienced it, but there's this exhilaration when a find sticks, when you pull at something seemingly innocuous and it shifts beneath the mud, like there's an extra appendage buried deep below your feet. Now, usually that extra appendage is a rock or a rusty pipe or a tangle of fishing net, but mudlarks have found honest-to-God treasures beneath innocent debris. That's what the doll felt like, just for a second, like it was pushing itself loose from deep below the earth. Slowly, inch by inch, I dug it out of the mud. It's hard work, the mudlarking game. I run a blog, one of those hobbies that kind of spiraled into a semi-proper job. So trust me when I say I'm in deep. Mudlarking's like beachcombing, picking through all the odds and ends left over after a high tide. Only rather than the beach, I'm freezing in my wellies and gloves on the banks of the River Thames, trying not to cut myself open on ancient rubbish. It's a niche community, especially among the hardcore lot. But I get plenty of casual fans interested in the weird stuff. And trust me when I say I find some weird stuff. Typically, my finds come in two categories: plain disgusting and interesting almost junk. Old coins and cans and false teeth, rust in pipes and ancient tiles. But sometimes I hit gold. I found a Roman coin down near London Bridge, or a bottle of rubber frogs, or all those plastic mannequin heads last spring. And when I do, I take a picture and post it on the blog. As surreal as it sounds, doll parts aren't particularly rare. Anything flimsier than pottery gets pulled to pieces by the current. I dredge up plenty of arms and legs and heads every month, both China and plastic. The thing that struck me this time, really struck me, was the doll's condition. Even drenched in muck, it was beautiful. One of those Victorian dolls you see in antique shops, squirreled away behind glass. I can't imagine how much it must have cost. Even the clothes were intact. A neat little bustle in crinoline and faded baby blue, carved straight into the torso. Every limb molded with such care. Until I dislodged its head. Do you ever see a doll with teeth? The kind they made before we invented rational taste? Yeah, it was one of those. Its jaw clicked as it moved, and inside its mouth were these perfect little chipped china teeth grimacing at you. Lord knows how they survived, especially considering one of its eyes hadn't. Not only that, but almost the doll's entire face was gone. The carving was still there, nose and lips and cheeks as neat and perfect as the rest of it. But unless you stared hard, really hard, all you got was its empty black socket and a mouth full of perfect little teeth. Okay, the thing was creepy. Perfect and lovely and fucking creepy. Seeing that blank face was like watching a cockroach crawl out of its mouth or something. Just a split second of visceral weirdness. But it was almost Halloween, and weird was exactly what I needed. Give it a scrub, prop it against some tastefully gothic set dressing, and I'd have my Halloween post ready before mid-October. So I wrapped the doll in a plastic bag and carried it back to my flat in Southwark. After I'd let it soak for a few hours, I examined the doll again under my kitchen lights. What I'd taken for cracks and bumps in the head mold was actually hair. Silvery blonde and beautifully coiffed, molded straight across the doll's scalp. Hair is usually the first to go when a doll ends up in the Thames, and I'd almost forgotten these things weren't habitually bald. I uncovered further details as I washed away the mud. Little hand-carved buttons at the throat and wrists, tiny crinkles in the skirt and bodice, the excruciating handiwork of someone trying desperately to convince the world that China was pristine blue silk. It didn't make the face any less surreal, or any less beautiful. It felt unfair somehow. Something so delicate, reduced to river waste. I wondered where it'd come from, who'd owned it. How, of all things, it had ended up in the Thames. It was sitting in the sink when Harrison found it. Harrison Finchley was handsome. Harrison Finchley was charming. And Harrison Finchley was a flake. He hopped from job to job, girlfriend to girlfriend, and seemed to consider our apartment more a permanent storage space than a home. He wasn't a bad guy, just dozy. And on the rare occasions he spent more than a night in the flat, he was perfectly friendly. So I tolerated his absences. The space gave me carte blanche to work on my finds. And he never complained when they oozed or rotted or stunk up the kitchen sink. His flatmate, we had a good deal worked out. He smiled a lot. Smiled when he greeted me. Smiled when we argued. Smiled when he stumbled in at 6 a.m. on a Monday morning. Smiled like he didn't have a care in the world. That's what I'll always remember about him. I wish it wasn't. He plucked the doll out of the sink on his way to the fridge, turning it over and over in his hands. We'd seen a lot of weird and wonderful things in my time running the blog, but I remember he seemed particularly fascinated by this one. As fascinated as I'd been. Then he asked me what the writing was for. I asked him what he meant. I hadn't seen any writing. And he turned the doll over and pointed to its back. Leaning closer, I saw that something had indeed been written, straight down the doll's spine. Imperfect. Imperfect, 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 imperfect. Just like that. One word over and over and over again. Harrison laughed, said maybe the doll's maker knew how creepy it was, wanted to warn us. But the phrase didn't read like a maker's mark. The writing was too deliberate, a little too handmade. It gave me a chill. That should have been red flag number 3, but like I said, I find weird shit. A couple years ago, a mudlark uncovered candles and dead rats and these weird little occult figurines down under London Bridge. It was in the papers. People like weird stuff. And in London, well, people get weird. So I took the doll back, cleaned it up, and more or less forgot about the writing. The photos did well. Got featured in a few Halloween listicle articles. Top 10 spooky London finds. You won't believe number 8. Stuff like that. I'm not talking serious traction, but enough to boost my revenue for a few weeks. That's probably why I kept it. The doll creeped me out, sure, but I was pleased with it. I always kept the strange or popular finds. Kinda reminds me why I started the blog, you know? Why I like showing people this stuff. And something about the doll's delicate crafting made me reluctant to just throw it away. The same twisted pity I'd felt before. I want to say the weird shit started after that. Furniture moving around, phones ringing in the dead of night, the lights turning on and off by themselves. Anything that might have forewarned us. But no. I took my photos, made my Halloween post, returned to slogging through the Thames mud to feed the blog machine. And that was it. For maybe a month. Then the eye went missing. It wasn't much, just a glass eye picked up down by Westminster a few years previously. Greenish blue, maybe 1960s. Nothing beautiful, but even after a trip down the Thames, it was almost intact. It was the first really interesting thing I'd found as an official mudlark. So I'd washed it, kept it, stuck it in a box on my desk. My good luck charm. I don't know when exactly it vanished. I spent a lot of time at my desk, editing and writing and curating the website, and I never saw it go. I just glanced over one day while checking emails and realized its box was empty. I checked the floor, checked the drawers, checked behind the desk just in case, but I couldn't find it anywhere. The eye had rolled off somewhere into the deep recesses of our apartment, maybe shaken free by an accidental nudge or my own carelessness while cleaning, vanishing into thin air. And that was it. A weird little mundane occurrence. Frustrating, sure. I liked that eye. And I hadn't exactly planned on losing it. But nothing devastating, so life went on. Until about a week later, when I was clearing out the storage boxes. Now, I like my finds, but no one wants a flat chair covered in river tat, so Harrison and I had agreement. Anything I want to keep I store in a big plastic box in the hallway cupboard. That's my own space, my own private collection. Harrison and I don't have much in the way of coats, and all our cleaning stuff lives under the sink, so our cupboard became home to the Hoover and my neat little stack of Tam's treasures. Nothing thrown away, and nothing cluttering up the living room for house guests to see. I wrap everything individually in newspaper before stacking them carefully in the box. But sometimes bits just break. A handful of decades floating down the Thames will do that, even if a piece looks relatively sturdy. So I have a habit of monitoring things, taking inventory every few months just in case. I was on my knees in the cupboard, gloves on, a bowl of soapy water by my knees, rummaging through the largest box when my hand brushed against something crunchy. I pulled it out, expecting more sand, to find my fingers covered in tiny pieces of glass. Glass smashed so fine it was almost dust. That box had been home to a fair few glass bottles in its time, and at first I thought one of them had exploded under the weight. Cursing myself, I hauled out the top layer of newspaper to survey the damage. Glass littered the bottom of the box, covered it from end to end in gritty little shards of white. Now, most bottles I find are green or blue, with the occasional piece of yellow. White glass is rare, and I certainly didn't have enough to make this mess. The more I lifted out, the more I found, sticking to the undersides of newspaper packages and coating my fingers. As I lifted the final few parcels out of the box, my hand brushed against something else, something smooth and porcelain, something free of newspaper. It was the doll. It lay face down at the bottom of the box. Lifting it up, I realized there was something protruding out of its mouth. A rounded curve of glass, remnants of blue and black fractured across its surface. That's when it dawned on me. I was looking at my glass eye. My glass eye, ground into tiny little bits and stuffed inside the doll's stiff little jaw mechanism, staring up at me from a box I'd closed almost a month ago. I told myself I'd accidentally crushed the eye in the Hoover. Maybe the desk had moved and trapped it under one of the legs. Help, maybe Harrison had stepped on it and tried to bury the evidence. The glass was old. Surely it wouldn't take much to break. But that didn't explain how it ended up in the hall, or mixed in with the doll, or how the doll had somehow wiggled free from its newspaper to find it. You know when something weird happens and your brain can't connect the dots, so it pretends the dots don't exist? Someone changes unexpectedly, something vanishes from a locked cupboard, or you find it where it shouldn't be. It eats away at you until your brain can't handle the weirdness, forms a barrier around the event, pushes it deep down, and buries it under the weight of normal stuff, lists and routine and grocery shopping. I think that's what I did with the glass eye. I swept up the pieces, cleaned the inside of the box, wrapped it all back up again, and just ignored it. Weird shit over and done with. I remember November as a particularly difficult month, but not for supernatural reasons. The chill off the Thames is ruthless in winter, slogging down in the freezing mud for something, anything to post to the blog. It all becomes a painful, bitter chore, even with good boots and sturdy gloves and a hungry online following. I found the usual things, pottery and pipe bowls, bits of old boots and smooth river glass, but no more dolls. Thank God, no more dolls. November came and went, leaving the long expanse of December spread out ahead of us. The Christmas season brought colder days and longer, merciless nights, and me, down in the mud with my torch and wellies, miserable. No wonder people kept a backlog for the winter season. I saw less and less of Harrison. With his vast circle of friends, he was making the most of London's holiday atmosphere. The flat became a mostly solo affair, and that suited me just fine. I found myself enjoying the Thames less and less, stopped going outside, stopped visiting the riverbanks. By the time Christmas rolled around, I was practically starved for blog content, and mudlarking was my livelihood. So I started recycling posts. Plenty of people do it. Take a few fresh photos of old finds, adjust the lighting, and boom. Fresh new content. It stretches things out, frees the algorithm. Means I don't starve to death. As soon as I picked it up, I knew something had changed. But now I hadn't seen the doll in 2 months, and it was popular. People were still messaging me about the original photos. I thought a revival post, maybe something Christmas ghost theme, appropriately Dickensian, was just what the blog needed. What my revenue needed. To my relief, it was still wrapped in newspaper, so I put my strange feelings down to the dreary weather and my isolation alone in an empty flat, and got to work setting up an appropriate midwinter photo shoot. It was only later that evening, when I brought up the old photos to check for inconsistencies, that I realized what my eyes had noticed before my brain. The doll had new clothes. In October, its dress had been molded straight onto its body, a smooth transition from porcelain skin to porcelain cloth. In the time between then and now, someone had fashioned it a neat little smock, made of thin white cloth and clumsy haphazard stitches. I stared at it, my heart pounding, trying to reconcile the impossible. It was almost too funny, too strange, too bizarre to be frightening. But then I pictured my glass eye, crushed with enough force to render it powder, eaten by a doll with a missing eye of its own. It now seemed to have constructed a brand new dress for itself too. That wasn't quite so funny. Suddenly, I didn't want to touch the doll. The sight of it lying there on the table in our bright, clean kitchen, surrounded by gloves and pans and cleaning products, felt anathematic, deeply wrong, mocking. I needed to breathe. I needed to go. I grabbed my coat and my keys, left the doll where it was, and ran. I found myself down on the riverbank for the first time in weeks, past Southwark, under London Bridge, and toward Blackfriars. Up steps and down across brackish sand, ignoring everyone, ignoring anything that wasn't directly in front of me. My shoes sank into the mud, soaking my socks and freezing my feet. I don't know what I was looking for, what I expected to find. But I wanted to find it more than I wanted to think about the flat, about the doll I'd left propped on the kitchen table. The next thing I knew, it was evening. The Thames lay to the right of me, an ink-black glimmer, and something thin and white was waving from the water's edge. It was the corner of a bedsheet this time, soiled and ragged, sticking up from the mud. I knelt down and tugged at it, almost entranced, until it trailed up through my hands like a sodden sail. It was almost entirely intact, a miracle considering the water damage, save for a cluster of neat, careful holes, traced too fine to be rips in the fabric, shapes that, without the obscuring effect of water and dirt, could have almost been a dress pattern. I can't say it was ours. I won't say it was ours. I can't prove anything. At that point, I would have associated anything with that damn doll. But what I do know, and what I desperately wish I didn't, is that at some point between October and December, one of our sheets went missing from the hallway cupboard. A sheet I'd been unable to find. A white cotton bed sheet. I left it lying there in the mud, got myself back on dry land, and spent the night at a friend's in Wimbledon, as far from the Thames as possible. That night I dreamt of tiny chipped glass teeth, of bitter unfairness, and of a single word spiraling over and over again across the mud under Blackfriars Bridge. Harrison was waiting for me when I got back the next morning. His hair was a mess, his face red, raw, and seething. At first, I thought he was drunk. That maybe one of his girlfriends had kicked him out early and he'd be forced to crawl back to the flat. Until I saw what he was holding. It was the doll. He held it upside down by the leg, its neat little smock hanging awkwardly over its face. I caught a glimpse of its spine as he swung it back and forth. The words almost legible. Imperfect, 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 imperfect. Harrison asked what the fuck I thought I was doing. He said he'd woken up in the middle of the night with the doll sitting on his chest. Staring at him, he said. Staring at him. He accused me of going into his room, rifling through his things. Said I was trying to scare him, creep him out with all my fucking river junk. I tried to explain that I'd been nowhere near the flat last night, that I wanted him to put the doll down, but Harrison wouldn't listen. He threw it at me. I ducked. The doll flew past me, hit the coffee table with a crunch, and landed face down on the carpet. Something deep and dreadful rose in my chest. Suddenly, I wanted to throw myself at Harrison. Wanted to smash his drunk fucking face in. Harrison was never my friend, but this was different. This was a spark of pure, unfettered rage. I ran to the doll and scooped it up, partly so Harrison wouldn't see my face, partly to stop myself from doing something to him. There was a middling-sized chip taken out of the doll's top lip, right where the tabletop had struck it. The delicate wire in its jaw had snapped, leaving the mouth hanging open in a terrible parody of surprise. A few tiny white teeth lay scattered on the carpet, so small and delicate they were almost lost in the weave. Harrison stormed out, leaving me with the doll and the mess. I'm not sure why I didn't throw it away. It wasn't worth the price of fixing it. I knew that. But something stopped me. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't possessiveness. It was a feeling I'd felt upon discovering the doll, when I'd found it with the glass eye, watching as Harrison threw it across the room. A deep, bitter unfairness. It was imperfect. It looked imperfect again, and that was almost unbearable. Shaken, I put the doll back in its box and stumbled to bed. I slept terribly. Harrison didn't emerge the next morning, or the next, or the next. This was typical Harrison behavior. I assumed he was sulking or passed out at one of his girlfriends, too sullen to text me. But by Saturday, at which point he'd usually clatter into midnight with one of his weekly appearances, I began to worry. Harrison was a flake, but he'd never vanished before. I called his mobile, left messages, even visited his usual bars, but no one had seen him. Eventually, bereft of options, I fished the spare key out of the kitchen drawer and tried his room. I don't know what I expected to find. I don't know what I thought he might have done. I don't know if I was upset or relieved upon easing open the door to find Harrison's bedroom empty. His bed was unmade. His carpet the same array of dirty clothes and old cutlery I'd grown to loathe. But Harrison wasn't there. The doll was, though. It lay spread-eagled in the center of the room, its eyes shining like it had a secret it had been waiting all week to tell me. Out of its box. Out of the cupboard. But that wasn't the worst of it. That wasn't what filled me with such visceral dread. Someone had cut a perfect circular hole across the doll's forehead, all the way along the top, like a breakfast egg or a tin of tuna, leaving the cranium wide open, and embedded around the inside of the skull, round and round in a perfect spiral, were teeth. Rows and rows of human teeth. Harrison still hadn't reappeared. I've considered calling the police, but what exactly do I tell them? That a haunted doll I dredged up from the Thames whisked away my flatmate, and what? Sometimes I picture myself returning to where I first uncovered the doll, sitting down past the water line and digging until I discover something buried beneath the mud. Something that stares up at me with glassy black eyes and an empty, toothless mouth. Something that was once Harrison. Something the doll collected. Everyone's waste ends up in the Thames eventually. I'm gonna jam the doll in a box and throw it over Blackfriars. I've decided, and I don't care. Maybe it already knows. Christ, I'm sure it does. Maybe it'll find me. Maybe it'll pass itself onto some poor bastard. Whatever happens, it'll buy me time to get out of London. Away from the Thames. What else is the doll missing? What other parts does it need? I remember that thing's blank, staring eye. I remember its rubbed away face. The little parts of it that weren't quite perfect. I remember the glass eye. I remember Harrison's shiny, perfect teeth, spiraling away down the doll's hollow insides. Perfectly ordered. Perfectly collected. And I pray to God I have nothing it wants.